One of the most heated debates in recent decades has been whether the phrase, the faith of Christ, pistis Christi, refers to Christ's own faith, rendering the Greek genitive subjectively, or our faith in Jesus Christ, rendering the genitive objectively. Oftentimes it's been portrayed as if this is somehow an all-determining decision for how you're going to read Paul's theology or how you'll think about the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's been portrayed by some as if one rendering gives you a Christological approach to theology, the other sends you down the path of an anthropocentric approach to theology. I want to suggest that such matters are not uninteresting, but they're far overstated. Many traditionalists have steered away from the idea of Christ exercising faith, believing that somehow this would undercut our call to faith. Many iconoclasts or revisionist approaches to Paul have suggested that if you do not affirm that this phrase refers to Jesus' own belief and trust in God, his obedience before the Father, then you are right back to Feuerbach and an anthropological approach to religion, the worst of modern liberalism. But actually the tradition provides us resources to sort of thread the needle, not necessarily to render the phrase in a subjective way, as the Christ's own faith, but no doubt to affirm that the doctrine, the idea of Christ exercising faith is crucial, necessary, an essential part of the gospel. Other texts outside the Pauline corpus, like the Epistle to the Hebrews, point out that Jesus, in fact, does take on full human form and nature. He does experience life like us in every respect, yet without sin. He does live as the perfect paradigm of faith. He's the author and perfecter of it. And so it's essential to affirm that on his earthly sojourn, on this journey through death and back, he believes and trusts in his Father. He turns himself over to death, believing the Father by the Spirit will raise him from the dead. Now, the Pauline phrase, pistis Christi, may or may not refer to that, but if we honor the wider biblical teaching, we're now freed to actually do exegesis without believing that somehow it determines in this macrocosmic way whether or not we'll be Christological or anthropocentric. It frees us from that massive decision and allows us simply to do the careful exegetical work of grammatical and contextual study. And at the same time, it reminds us that though Paul may not teach that idea here, the Bible certainly witnesses to it in the gospel accounts, in Hebrews, and elsewhere. It seems to me this is one example of how looking back at the tradition and wider teaching on theology, for example, the obedience of Christ, the nature of Christ as the last Adam, the notion of Christ as taking on our full humanity, as Chalcedon has affirmed, how this can be a resource, but also a prompt to further study that we could extend in the modern era about the subjective nature of Christ's walk as a human being, about the particularly spiritual character of his lifelong ministry, that he didn't simply go from the virgin birth to the cross itself, but he actually journeyed. As John Calvin told us, from the time he took the form of a servant, he began our work of redemption. Modern study has prompted us to ask, what was the character of that servant-like work? And while we need not allow the pistis Christi debate to determine the overall character of our theology of salvation, we ought to let it shape us and instigate further thought about the precise nature in which the life of Christ is a constituent part of the gospel. That's a prompt that modern discussion and contemporary questions allow for deeper expansion of the traditional reflection on the work of Christ. Justification in the Gospels, attempting to give us fresh eyes to look at some off-worn and much frustrating questions that have really bedeviled modern New Testament studies. But questions that are important and that prompt deep and fresh thought on the nature of the gospel. How does Christ's own faith relate to ours? How does justification relate to the idea of participation or union with God in Christ? In the book, I'm hoping to draw the reader's attention to the fact that more often than not, these questions are not exclusive, not either or dichotomies whereby you go down one door and forget the other, but rather that the New Testament in different language and the tradition in different categories has tried to attend to each of these concerns.